The late summer heat shimmered across the plains outside Pueblo, where retired Marshal Luke Carter stood on his front porch, watching a dust cloud approach his ranch. After 15 years of keeping the peace, he'd sought solitude among his cattle and the endless grasslands. But peace had a way of slipping through a man's fingers like water, especially in Colorado territory of 1876. The approaching riders meant his quiet days were numbered. Joshua Nelson, the new territorial marshal, dismounted first. Behind him, two deputies kept their rifles trained on an elderly Sioux man seated atop a paint horse. The Indian's weathered face remained impassive, though his bound hands spoke of captivity. Carter recognized him immediately. Running Wolf, a respected medicine man who'd helped broker peace between settlers and tribes for decades. "Luke, we need your help," Nelson said without preamble. Running Wolf here is accused of murdering Isaac Hall, a prospector who'd been working claims near the reservation. Governor wants him tried in Durango, but my men are stretched thin dealing with claim jumpers. You know these territories better than anyone. I need you to escort him. Carter studied the old Sioux man, noting the quiet dignity in his bearing despite the ropes binding his wrists. Something about the situation felt wrong. Isaac Hall had been a notorious claim jumper himself, always pushing boundaries and stirring up trouble. The idea of Running Wolf murdering anyone, let alone a white man during such tense times, seemed unlikely. "What evidence do you have?" Carter asked, his voice gravelly from disuse. Nelson handed him a folded paper, an affidavit signed by Eleanor Allen, wife of the local army captain. She claimed to have witnessed Running Wolf leaving Hall's camp the night of the murder. But her husband had been pushing to expand Fort Holdings onto reservation land, which made Carter suspicious of her testimony. The breeze carried the sweet scent of prairie grass as Carter considered his options. Taking the assignment meant leaving his ranch in the hands of his foreman, Caleb Lopez, during the busy fall roundup. But refusing meant Running Wolf would face a long journey in chains, treated like a common criminal. The old lawman had seen too many Indians railroaded by corrupt courts to let that happen. 3 days to prepare, Carter said finally. "I'll need to arrange things here first." Nelson nodded, relief evident in his expression. The deputies began setting up camp nearby, keeping Running Wolf under guard. As twilight approached, Carter watched the old medicine man sitting cross-legged, facing the setting sun in silent prayer. The mystery of Hall's death nagged at him like a splinter under skin. That evening, Carter rode into Pueblo to gather supplies and information. The Saloon talk centered around a massive gold strike in the mountains near the reservation, with prospectors flooding the area despite tribal objections. Charlotte Nelson, the marshal's wife who ran the general store, mentioned seeing army wagons heading that direction loaded with survey equipment. The pieces were starting to form a troubling pattern. Back at his ranch, Carter spent hours in his study, poring over maps and old correspondence. Isaac Hall had been writing to mining investors in Denver, hinting at a massive discovery. But the location he described fell squarely within protected tribal lands. If Running Wolf had discovered Hall's plans to steal reservation territory, it might explain their conflict, but murder still seemed out of character. The next morning brought Caroline Carter, Luke's daughter, riding in from her teaching position at the reservation school. Her face was drawn with worry as she described increasing tensions between settlers and the tribe. "The children speak of strange men watching their camps at night," she said, "and army patrols keep getting closer to their sacred grounds. Father, Running Wolf would never kill without reason." While Caleb Lopez supervised the ranch hands preparing for Carter's absence, the old lawman began gathering his own supplies. He chose his most reliable mount, a sturdy bay gelding, and packed light but practical. Years of tracking outlaws had taught him to read signs others missed. The journey to Durango would give him time to uncover the truth, assuming someone didn't try to stop him first. 2 days later, Carter watched dawn break across the prairie, painting the sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold. Running Wolf sat nearby, finally free of his ropes but wearing iron manacles. They would leave within the hour, following the old Santa Fe trail before cutting west toward Durango. But first, Carter had arrangements to make. Quiet words with trusted friends who would watch for certain signals and investigate certain suspicions. Rose Hall, Isaac's sister, arrived just before their departure. Her eyes were red from crying, but something in her manner struck Carter as artificial. She made a show of confronting Running Wolf, but the old medicine man's calm response seemed to unsettle her. The truth follows its own path, he said in careful English. Like water, it cannot be forever blocked. Rose hurried away, but not before Carter noticed her glancing nervously toward the fort. As they rode out, Carter spotted cavalry riders watching from a distant ridge. Captain Allen's men had been suspiciously present since Running Wolf's arrest. The old lawman adjusted his gun belt, making sure his revolvers rode easy. His instincts told him this journey would be far from peaceful. But sometimes the path to justice required walking through danger. And Luke Carter had never been one to take the easy trail when hard truth beckoned. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the prairie grass as Carter and Running Wolf made their way eastward. The old Sioux rode with dignity despite his bound hands, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Carter had chosen to take the less-traveled routes toward Pueblo, avoiding the main trails where ambush would be easier. His years as a lawman had taught him that the obvious path often led to trouble. As they made camp that first evening, Carter noticed how Running Wolf studied the distant horizon where heat waves still shimmered above the plains. "There was gold here once," the medicine man said unexpectedly, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "Not in the ground, but in the grass that fed our buffalo. Now men dig holes and poison the water searching for yellow metal." The observation struck Carter as oddly specific, making him wonder about connections to the murder charges. Their fire burned low as Carter kept watch, his mind turning over the details that didn't add up. Isaac Hall's body had been found near an abandoned mining claim, yet the settler had no known interest in prospecting. And why had Rose seemed so nervous around the fort? Captain Allen's unexpected involvement suggested military interest beyond a simple murder case. The pieces refused to fit together cleanly. The next morning brought riders on the horizon, 3 dots moving parallel to their course. Carter recognized the military precision in their spacing. "Friends of yours?" he asked Running Wolf dryly. The old man's slight smile carried a hint of satisfaction. "The cavalry believes they watch us," he replied. "But my people watch them. The grass has many eyes." Carter nodded, understanding that allies moved unseen around them. They passed the ruins of an old ranch near midday. Running Wolf spoke of how it had belonged to Joshua Whitebear, a peaceful man who had tried living in both worlds. "He found gold," the medicine man said. "Not much, but enough. Then soldiers came with papers saying the land was needed. Joshua disappeared." Carter reined his horse to a stop, seeing connections start to form. "When was this?" he asked sharply. 3 moons before Isaac Hall died," came the careful reply. The afternoon brought dark clouds and distant thunder. Carter led them toward a sheltered draw he knew from his ranging days. As they made camp beneath overhanging rocks, he noticed Running Wolf studying the stone walls. "The earth remembers," the old man said, touching marks in the rock. "Here, men dug for gold long ago. They found death instead when the rains came." Carter examined the old mining debris half buried in the draw, evidence of another failed search for riches. That night, as rain drummed against their shelter, Running Wolf spoke of changes coming to the plains. "The buffalo are gone, but men's hunger grows stronger. They smell gold in the wind and it drives them mad. Even those who wear the stars of authority are not immune." Carter thought of Captain Allen's strange behavior and Rose's nervous glances. The murder charge was beginning to feel like a carefully constructed facade. Lightning revealed glimpses of the countryside, and Carter caught movement at the draw's entrance, a rider passing quickly through the storm. He recognized the silhouette of army-issue gear but held his fire. "One of your watchers?" he asked Running Wolf. The old man shook his head. "Number that one carries messages between the fort and the place where Isaac died. He does not know he is followed." Carter added this to his mental map of the conspiracy taking shape. A murdered settler, nervous sister, corrupt officers, abandoned mines, and disappeared landowners, all connected by whispers of gold. But something was missing, a piece that would make the pattern clear. As thunder rolled across the plains, Carter knew the storm around them was more than just rain and lightning. Forces were moving, and their journey to Pueblo was becoming far more dangerous than a simple prisoner transport. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling plains as Luke Carter guided his horse along the worn trail, his weathered face set in grim determination. The retired lawman had been tracking his charge, Sioux elder Nathan Hall, for 3 days through the grasslands north of Pueblo. Though Hall rode willingly beside him now, Luke couldn't shake the feeling that this escort mission concealed darker truths than the simple murder charge suggested. Nathan's deep voice broke the silence between them. The white man who died, Isaac Lopez. He was no innocent settler. He worked for the mining companies, marking tribal lands for gold claims that didn't exist. The elder's eyes held a wisdom that made Luke increasingly uneasy about his role in this journey to justice. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, like a coiled rattler hidden in tall grass. They made camp that evening near a shallow creek, the endless sea of prairie grass swaying in the cool breeze. As Luke prepared their meager supper, Nathan shared more about the growing tensions between the mining interests and his people. Lopez and his partner Joshua Carter, your cousin, I believe, they've been stirring trouble for months, promising gold discoveries to draw settlers onto protected lands. Luke's hand froze over the coffee pot. He hadn't known his cousin Joshua was involved, though it explained why the territorial judge had specifically requested him for this escort. Joshua always was driven by greed, Luke admitted, studying Nathan's composed features in the firelight. But murder seems an unlikely response from a man of your standing. The sound of approaching riders interrupted their conversation. 3 men emerged from the gathering dusk, led by Caleb Nelson, a cattle baron Luke recognized from his lawman days. Nelson's ranch bordered the disputed tribal territories, and his smile didn't reach his cold eyes as he dismounted. Quite a coincidence finding you out here, Carter. Escorting our murder suspect to Pueblo? Luke's hand instinctively moved closer to his holstered revolver. Official business, Nelson. Best you ride on. But Nelson's men had already spread out around the camp, their intentions clear. The cattle baron's next words confirmed Luke's suspicions about larger forces at work. That old Indian knows too much about certain arrangements. He won't be making it to any trial. What happened next unfolded with frightening speed. Nathan knocked over the coffee pot with his foot, sending sparks and steam hissing into the faces of Nelson's closest man. Luke drew and fired in one fluid motion, catching another attacker in the shoulder. But Nelson's bullet found its mark, tearing into Luke's left arm as he dove for cover behind a fallen log. Through the chaos of gunfire and shouts, Luke glimpsed Nathan slipping away into the darkness. The elder moved with surprising agility for his age, using the confusion to escape. Luke provided covering fire until his revolver clicked empty, then rolled into the creek bed as Nelson's men charged the camp. The cold water numbed his wounded arm as he crawled through the reeds, following Nathan's path into the night. Dawn found them holed up in an abandoned homestead 10 miles east, Luke's arm crudely bandaged with strips torn from his shirt. Nathan had proven himself both a skilled healer and an unexpected ally. Those men work for Eleanor Carter, the elder explained while checking Luke's wound. Your cousin Joshua's wife. She inherited control of the mining company when her father died last spring. Luke absorbed this revelation with growing anger. Eleanor had always been ambitious, but he'd never suspected she'd resort to murder and land theft. The gold claims are false, then? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Nathan nodded grimly. The real wealth is in the water rights. Control the rivers, control the ranches. Lopez was killed because he planned to expose the scheme. They spent the day gathering supplies and information from a sympathetic rancher named Caroline Allen, whose small spread had suffered under Eleanor's expanding influence. Caroline confirmed that several other homesteaders had been forced out through various means: mysterious fires, poisoned wells, threatened violence. Your cousin's wife has half the territorial officials in her pocket, she warned them. Luke's mind raced with possibilities as they prepared to move on. His official mission was compromised, but a greater justice needed serving. We're going to need proof, he told Nathan. Documents, witnesses, something to take to the federal marshals. The elder smiled for the first time since their journey began. I know where to find it, but first, we must visit someone in Durango. A banker named Charlotte Lopez, Isaac's widow. Their path now led south, away from Pueblo's courthouse and toward a deeper conspiracy than either man had imagined at the start of their journey. Luke's wounded arm served as a constant reminder of the dangers ahead, but also of the unexpected bond forged between lawman and elder. As they rode through the endless prairie, both men knew their survival, and justice itself, depended on trusting each other completely. The vast plains stretched before them like an ocean of grass, hiding both peril and promise in its rolling waves. Luke found himself studying his companion with new eyes, seeing not a suspect, but a fellow seeker of truth. Whatever waited for them in Durango, they would face it together. An unlikely partnership born of violence but sustained by a shared commitment to exposing the real criminals in this tangled web of greed and deception. By nightfall, they had covered nearly 20 miles, keeping to lesser-used trails and avoiding the main roads where Nelson's men might be watching. They made camp in a sheltered draw, and as they shared a simple meal, Nathan taught Luke traditional Sioux healing songs to help with his injured arm. The peaceful moment stood in stark contrast to the dangerous path ahead, but both men drew strength from their growing friendship and common cause. The following morning brought an unsettling discovery. Fresh hoofprints in the mud near their camp revealed they weren't alone in these remote grasslands. Luke recognized the distinctive pattern of Army-issue horseshoes, the same ones he'd seen during his years as a lawman. Nathan's face darkened as he examined the tracks, confirming they belonged to a group of at least 6 riders who had passed through just hours before. "They're trying to box us in," Luke muttered, wincing as he adjusted the makeshift sling supporting his injured arm. "Moving us toward the narrow pass near Eagle Rock." Nathan nodded grimly, his weathered features etched with concern. The elder's deep knowledge of these lands had already proved invaluable, and Luke found himself increasingly convinced of the man's innocence. As they mounted up and continued their journey, Nathan shared more details about the murdered settler, Isaac, who had been one of the few white men to treat the Sioux with respect. "He discovered something in those hills," Nathan explained, gesturing toward the distant peaks. "Something that made powerful men nervous. The night before his death, he came to me seeking counsel, speaking of corruption that went beyond simple land grabs." The midday sun beat down mercilessly as they skirted a vast cattle ranch, its endless fences a stark reminder of how the open plains were being carved into private kingdoms. A rider appeared on the horizon, and both men tensed until they recognized the distinctive blue dress of Caroline, Isaac's widow. She had risked everything to warn them, defying those who wanted Nathan silenced before the truth could emerge. "Joshua's men were at my door last night," Caroline reported, her voice tight with barely contained anger. "They're not just army officers anymore, they're working with the mining companies." Isaac found proof of their scheme, documentation of illegal claims and forged treaties. She passed Luke a worn leather pouch containing papers that could expose the entire conspiracy. The sound of distant gunfire interrupted their conversation, echoing across the prairie. Caroline quickly mounted her horse and headed south, while Luke and Nathan sought cover in a nearby ravine. The pursuers were getting bold, abandoning subtlety for brute force. As bullets kicked up dust around them, Luke caught glimpses of uniforms among their attackers, confirmation that corrupt army officials were indeed involved. Nathan's calm under fire impressed Luke. The elder methodically returned fire while sharing his knowledge of a hidden trail that could lead them to safety. "There's an old trading post near the border of Pueblo territory," he explained between shots. "A man named Caleb runs it. He was Isaac's friend and might still have evidence we need." As the sun began to set, they managed to slip away from their pursuers, but the cost was steep. Their supplies were running low, and Luke's wound had begun to show signs of infection. Nathan noticed his companion's deteriorating condition and insisted they make camp in a hidden box canyon he knew. There, by firelight, the elder shared more of his people's healing knowledge, brewing a poultice from prairie herbs that brought immediate relief to Luke's festering injury. "Tomorrow we reach Caleb's trading post," Nathan said as they studied their remaining supplies. "But Joshua's men will be watching all the obvious approaches." Luke nodded, understanding the implications. They would have to risk the treacherous canyon path, a route so dangerous it was usually avoided even by the most desperate travelers. In the darkness, Luke found himself reflecting on how his simple assignment to escort a prisoner had evolved into something far more complex. The corruption they were uncovering threatened not just the Sioux, but every honest settler in the territory. The gold discoveries in the hills had unleashed a savage greed that was consuming everything in its path, and somehow Isaac had stumbled upon evidence that could expose it all. As they prepared for sleep, taking turns at watch, a distant wolf's howl echoed through the canyon. Nathan listened intently, then smiled slightly. "The wolves remind us that some things remain free, despite men's attempts to claim everything for themselves," he said. Tomorrow, we make our stand for that freedom. Luke checked his revolver one last time, knowing that the next day would either see them closer to justice or dead in the unforgiving prairie soil. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plains outside Durango, as Luke Carter and Joshua Hall crouched behind an overturned wagon, bullets splintering the wood around them. The Sioux elder, Nathan Lopez, remained eerily calm beside them, his weathered hands steady as he loaded cartridges into an old Winchester rifle. The conspiracy they'd uncovered was far bigger than a simple murder accusation. It stretched all the way to Fort Abraham and the highest levels of the territorial command. "Those aren't just hired guns," Luke muttered, squinting at their attackers' positions among the rocky outcrops. "Those are Army uniforms, Captain Isaac Allen's men." The realization hit him hard. The same captain who'd been so eager to see Nathan hang was now trying to ensure none of them made it to the territorial court in Pueblo alive. The truth about the gold deposits on Sioux land would die with them. Eleanor Nelson's warning from 2 days ago echoed in Luke's mind. The young widow had risked everything to slip him documents proving Captain Allen had orchestrated the murder of her husband, the former Indian agent, to prevent him from exposing the illegal mining operations. Now those same papers were tucked safely in Luke's saddlebag if they could just survive long enough to deliver them. Nathan touched Luke's arm, pointing to movement in the tall grass to their left. "Caleb," he whispered, identifying the captain's most ruthless lieutenant. The man was trying to flank their position, using the dying light to his advantage. Luke had seen enough of Caleb Carter's handiwork to know they couldn't let him get behind them. The memory of the massacred Sioux families they'd discovered still haunted his dreams. "We need to reach those trees before dark," Joshua said, checking his remaining ammunition. The young Army deserter had joined their cause after witnessing one too many atrocities under Allen's command. His knowledge of military tactics had kept them alive this far, but they were running dangerously low on options. The creek bed leading to the forest offered their only chance at escape. Charlotte Hall's ranch lay just 3 miles beyond those trees. Luke's old friend had promised them sanctuary, despite the risk to herself. Her spread was well defended, and her workers, mostly former slaves and Mexican vaqueros, were fiercely loyal. If they could make it there, they'd have a fighting chance of reaching Pueblo with their evidence. A bullet struck Nathan's shoulder, drawing a sharp grunt of pain. The old man's face remained stoic, as blood spread across his buckskin shirt. Luke's heart clenched. After everything they'd been through, after learning the truth about Nathan's innocence and the depth of corruption they faced, he couldn't let it end here. The elder had become more than just a prisoner in his charge. He'd become a friend and teacher. Joshua took advantage of a lull in the firing to loose 3 rapid shots, forcing their attackers to duck for cover. "Now!" he shouted, and they broke from behind the wagon, half running, half crawling toward the creek bed. Luke supported Nathan while Joshua provided covering fire. The distance seemed impossible, each step an eternity as bullets kicked up dirt around them. They were halfway to the trees when Caleb Carter emerged from the grass, rifle raised. Time seemed to slow as Luke saw the muzzle flash, felt Nathan tense beside him. But it was Joshua who took the bullet, spinning backward with a cry of pain. The young soldier's sacrifice gave Luke the moment he needed to draw and fire, watching Caleb crumple into the swaying prairie grass. Rose Lopez's voice carried across the darkening plain, accompanied by the thunder of hoofbeats. Nathan's daughter had arrived with reinforcements from Charlotte's ranch, a dozen riders armed with repeating rifles. Captain Allen's men scattered in the face of superior numbers, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The conspiracy was unraveling, but Luke knew the real battle still lay ahead in Pueblo. As they helped Nathan and Joshua onto horses, Luke caught sight of something glinting in the dying light. Gold dust spilled from Caleb's pocket, mixing with blood and soil. A fitting metaphor for the greed that had sparked this whole tragic affair. The truth about the murder of that settler, carefully framed to look like Nathan's work, would soon come to light. But the greater truth about the systematic theft of Sioux land would shake the territory to its core. Charlotte met them at her ranch house, her normally stern face softening at the sight of their wounds. "Josephine's already writing for the doctor in Durango," she said, helping them inside. "Eleanor arrived an hour ago with more evidence, documents proving Allen's dealing with mining companies. The territorial judge will have no choice but to act now." As Luke helped settle Nathan into a chair, the elder gripped his arm with surprising strength. "My people have a saying," he said softly. The truth is like a buffalo, slow to anger, but unstoppable when it charges. Looking into the old man's eyes, Luke saw not defeat or resignation, but hope. Tomorrow they would ride for Pueblo, carrying justice with them like a torch in the darkness. The night deepened around Charlotte's ranch as they tended their wounds and planned their next moves. Luke stood at the window, watching the stars emerge above the endless prairie. The conspiracy they'd uncovered went beyond simple greed or racism. It was about power, about who would control the future of this vast land. But tonight, at least, truth and honor had won a small victory. Dawn broke over the prairie as Luke, Nathan, and Charlotte prepared for the final ride to Pueblo. The documents Eleanor had brought were secured in Luke's saddlebag, their weight both physical and symbolic. The morning air carried the scent of sage and damp earth, a stark contrast to the tension that hung over their small group as they mounted their horses. Luke noticed Nathan wincing as he settled into his saddle, the elders' wounds from their previous encounter still tender. Charlotte had insisted on riding with them. Her medical skills might be needed, and more importantly, she could testify to what she'd witnessed at her ranch. The three riders set out across the grasslands, their horses' hooves drumming a steady rhythm against the earth. As they rode, Luke's mind wandered to the intricate web of corruption they'd uncovered. Alan's mining deals were just the surface. Beneath lay a complex network of army officers, territorial officials, and business interests all conspiring to steal Sioux lands. The thought of how many others might have suffered under this scheme made his jaw clench with renewed determination. The sun climbed higher as they passed through a narrow valley, the walls of ruddy stone rising around them like ancient guardians. Charlotte pulled her horse alongside Luke's. "There's something you should know," she said quietly. "I received word that Joshua's men were seen heading toward Pueblo yesterday. They're probably waiting for us." Before Luke could respond, Nathan raised his hand in warning. The old tracker's instincts hadn't dulled with age. Ahead, where the valley opened into a wider plain, fresh hoofprints marked the earth. Multiple riders had passed through recently, heading in the same direction they were traveling. They dismounted in a small grove of cottonwoods, discussing their options in hushed voices. The direct route to Pueblo would be watched, but Nathan knew of an old Sioux hunting trail that wound through the hills. It would add hours to their journey, but might be their only chance of reaching the territorial judge alive. As they led their horses through the rocky terrain, Charlotte shared what else she'd learned from Eleanor's investigations. The mining companies hadn't just been after gold. They'd discovered rich veins of copper, and with the railroad's expansion, the land's value had multiplied tenfold. The corruption went all the way to Washington, where senators had investments in the mining operations. The afternoon sun cast long shadows when they heard the first gunshot. The bullet struck the rocks above them, sending fragments of stone raining down. Luke pushed Nathan and Charlotte toward a natural hollow in the hillside as more shots rang out. He could make out at least 5 riders on the ridge above them, with Joshua's distinctive white horse visible among them. "You can't hide forever, Luke," Joshua's voice echoed across the rocks. "Hand over the old man and those papers, and maybe we'll let you and the lady ride away." The false friendliness in his tone made Luke's blood boil. He'd known Joshua for years, served with him in the army, but now he understood how deep the man's corruption ran. Nathan touched Luke's arm, his dark eyes serious. "There is another way," he said softly, pointing to a narrow crevice in the rocks. "It leads to an old cave system. My people used it to move unseen through these hills." Charlotte quickly began transferring the documents to a smaller bag they could carry more easily. The decision weighed heavily on Luke. The caves might offer escape, but they'd be trapped if Joshua's men found the entrance. Yet staying put would only delay the inevitable. As another bullet struck nearby, he made his choice. They would trust in Nathan's knowledge and the wisdom of his ancestors. What followed was a harrowing journey through darkness, guided only by Nathan's memory and the occasional shaft of light from above. The passages twisted and turned, some so narrow they had to squeeze through sideways. Behind them, they could hear distant shouts as Joshua's men discovered the cave entrance. After what seemed like hours, they emerged onto a high overlook with Pueblo visible in the distance. But their relief was short-lived. The sound of approaching horses came from both directions. Luke drew his pistol, preparing for what seemed like a final stand, when Charlotte suddenly smiled. "Look!" she exclaimed, pointing to the riders approaching from the east. The dust cloud revealed a large group of mounted men. But these weren't Joshua's outlaws. At their head rode Eleanor, accompanied by a dozen U.S. Marshals. She'd done more than just gather evidence. She'd brought the law with her, knowing the danger they'd face. The autumn wind carried the scent of smoke and sage across the plains as Luke Allen and Standing Bear made their final approach to Durango. The old lawman's heart was heavy with the truth they'd uncovered during their long journey, a truth that would shake the very foundations of the territory. Behind them rode Nathan Hall and Caroline Lopez, witnesses to the conspiracy they'd unearthed, their horses' hooves kicking up dust in the fading light. Standing Bear's weathered face remained stoic, but his eyes held a quiet triumph. The Sioux elder had maintained his innocence throughout their journey, and now they had proof that the murdered settler, Joshua Carter, had been killed by corrupt army officers working with local officials to steal native lands after false reports of gold discoveries. The scheme had nearly worked: frame a respected tribal leader, incite violence, and use the chaos to seize resource-rich territory. The streets of Durango were unusually crowded as they rode in, tension thick in the air. Word had spread fast about their return. Luke spotted several of Captain Isaac Nelson's men watching from the shadows, their hands hovering near their weapons. The corrupt officer had played a central role in the land theft conspiracy, using his position to intimidate witnesses and forge documents claiming gold deposits on Sioux hunting grounds. Caroline Lopez dismounted first, clutching the satchel containing the evidence they'd gathered: letters, maps, and sworn statements from other settlers who'd been threatened into silence. The young woman had risked everything to help them, defying her own father's warnings about getting involved. Her dark eyes met Luke's, sharing an unspoken acknowledgement of what was to come. "The territorial judge arrives tomorrow," Nathan Hall announced quietly as they secured their horses. The rancher had been one of the few whites to stand with Standing Bear from the beginning, losing cattle and grazing rights for his loyalty. Eleanor Nelson is ready to testify against her husband. She can't stomach what he's done to innocent people anymore. Inside the sheriff's office, they found Caleb Lopez, Caroline's brother and the newly appointed lawman, waiting with grim determination. He'd been gathering his own evidence of the conspiracy, building a case while they were away. The pieces were finally coming together, revealing the full scope of corruption that had poisoned the region. Standing Bear spoke softly in his native tongue, a prayer of gratitude that Luke had come to recognize during their weeks together. The old warrior had taught him much about justice, honor, and the true meaning of law. It went beyond badges and courts. It was about protecting the innocent and standing against evil, no matter its source. The night passed slowly as they prepared their case, organizing evidence and taking statements. Rose Allen, Luke's wife, brought food and coffee, her quiet strength a balancing force in the charged atmosphere. She'd been the one to first suspect something wasn't right about Joshua Carter's murder, her sharp mind picking up inconsistencies in the official story. Dawn brought Judge Charlotte Hall to town, her reputation for fairness preceding her. The courthouse filled quickly, settlers, townspeople, and tribal members gathering to witness justice unfold. Captain Nelson sat with his remaining loyal men, his facade of authority cracking as Eleanor took the stand first, revealing years of corruption and violence. The evidence was damning: maps showing false gold claim locations, forged documents, witness statements describing threats and beatings. Caroline's testimony about overhearing the plot to frame Standing Bear drew gasps from the crowd. Nathan Hall provided records of suspicious army movements coinciding with land grabs. The truth emerged like the sun breaking through storm clouds. When Standing Bear finally spoke, his words carried the weight of generations. He described the sacred connection between his people and the land, the broken promises, the attempts to provoke war. But he also spoke of hope, of whites and natives working together for true justice, like Luke and the others had done. The courthouse fell silent, moved by his wisdom and dignity. The verdict came swiftly. Captain Nelson and his conspirators were sentenced to prison, their stolen lands to be returned. Standing Bear was cleared of all charges, his honor restored. But more importantly, the case exposed the wider pattern of corruption that had plagued the territory, leading to reforms and new protections for native rights. Later that evening, as they gathered at Luke's ranch to celebrate, the old lawman watched Standing Bear teaching his grandchildren traditional songs around the fire. Caroline and Nathan sat close together, their shared ordeal having kindled something deeper, Rose served her famous venison stew, while Caleb and Eleanor discussed plans for healing the community's wounds. The stars emerged above the plains, unchanged by the day's events, yet somehow brighter. Luke reflected on how their journey had transformed them all, breaking down barriers of prejudice and fear. Standing Bear caught his eye across the fire and nodded, both men understanding that their unlikely friendship had helped forge a new path forward, one of justice, respect, and shared purpose in the changing West. The story of the false gold rush conspiracy became legend in Durango, passed down through generations as a reminder that truth and justice could prevail when good people stood together. The land remained free of mining claims, preserved for both native hunting and ranching, a living testament to the power of understanding between cultures. As autumn turned to winter, Luke often visited Standing Bear's camp, learning more about Sioux ways while sharing stories of his own. The old warrior had become like a brother, their bond forged in the pursuit of justice transcending the divisions others tried to create. Together, they watched their communities grow closer, healing old wounds and building a future neither could have imagined when their journey began. Spring came early that year, bringing with it the promise of renewal. Luke sat on his porch watching the prairie grass ripple like waves in the morning breeze, reflecting on how much had changed since that fateful escort mission. The letters from Standing Bear arrived regularly now, carried by young Sioux riders who stopped to share meals and stories before continuing their journeys between Durango and the reservation. In town, the changes were evident in small but meaningful ways. Where once there had been tension and segregation, now native traders were welcome in the general store, their crafts and goods sought after by settlers who had learned to appreciate the beauty of Sioux artistry. Caroline, who ran the store since her husband's passing, had become particularly close with Standing Bear's daughter, learning traditional beadwork patterns while sharing her knowledge of European textile techniques. The investigation into the original murder had yielded unexpected fruits. Documents discovered in Isaac's abandoned office revealed a web of corruption reaching all the way to Fort Laramie, where several officers had been quietly accepting bribes to look the other way while land speculators forged deeds and claims. Luke's testimony, combined with Standing Bear's knowledge of the territory, had helped federal marshals build an airtight case. Eleanor, the young journalist from Pueblo who had initially broken the story, arrived in Durango to interview Luke and Standing Bear for a series of articles about the conspiracy. Her presence stirred up old memories, but also highlighted how far they'd come. She marveled at seeing Sioux children playing with settler kids in the schoolyard, something unimaginable just a year before. The land that had nearly sparked a war now served as common ground. Under Standing Bear's guidance, local ranchers had adopted some traditional Sioux grazing practices, moving their herds in patterns that preserved the grasslands. Joshua, once the most skeptical of the ranchers, now regularly consulted with Standing Bear about weather patterns and the seasons, combining old wisdom with new techniques. One evening, as Luke and Standing Bear shared coffee on the porch, watching thunderheads build over the distant mountains, the old warrior spoke of his grandson's upcoming vision quest. To Luke's surprise, Standing Bear asked if he would participate in the ceremony, not as an observer, but as a spiritual uncle to the boy. The request symbolized more than just friendship. It was an acknowledgement of their shared journey toward understanding. The gold rush fever that had nearly destroyed their community had transformed into something more valuable, a recognition that the real wealth lay not in metal, but in the bonds between people and their connection to the land. Rose, who now taught at the local school, included both settler and Sioux history in her lessons, helping the next generation understand the importance of preserving both traditions. As summer approached, preparations began for the first joint celebration between the communities. The idea, proposed by Charlotte at a town council meeting, had initially met with resistance from some old-timers. But Standing Bear's quiet dignity and Luke's steady support had won over even the most hesitant citizens. The gathering would combine traditional Sioux ceremonies with settler festivities, creating something entirely new yet respectful of both cultures. The conspiracy that had nearly claimed Standing Bear's life had ultimately failed to divide the communities. Instead, it had revealed the strength that came from unity and mutual respect. Luke sometimes wondered what his younger self, the hard-bitten lawman who'd first taken on the escort mission, would think of the change in him. The answer, he knew, lay in the laughter of children playing together, in the shared meals between families once separated by suspicion, and in the way the land itself seemed to flourish under their combined care. As the sun set over the prairie, casting long shadows across the grasslands, Luke and Standing Bear sat in comfortable silence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but they faced them now not as individuals, but as part of something larger, a community that had learned to see beyond differences to the common humanity that bound them all together. The West was changing, but in Durango at least it was changing for the better.